and gentlemen, the Right Honorable Margaret Thatcher.
I want to welcome all of you to this very historic occasion at DePauw University. Having the Right Honorable Margaret H. Thatcher with us today to deliver the Timothy and Sharon Ubben Lecture for us this spring term is a distinct honor for all of us. I'd like to remind our audience, however, that Mrs. Thatcher is not the first British Prime Minister to visit with us. In 1958, Prime Minister Harold Macmillan delivered the commencement address at DePauw. It is noteworthy, as I explained to Mrs. Thatcher in the car this morning, that Mr. Macmillan undoubtedly accepted the DePauw invitation for some reasons that may not be known to many of you. You should know that Prime Minister Macmillan's mother, Nellie Bells Macmillan, was born in Spencer, Indiana, scarcely 30 miles from DePauw. And Macmillan's grandfather, Dr. Joshua Bells, was graduated from DePauw University over 140 years ago. Perhaps because of these family ties, Mr. Macmillan agreed to return to DePauw for yet a second time in 1968. Interestingly enough, the topic of each of his addresses to the DePauw community dealt with what we then called the Soviet Union, a subject which will undoubtedly surface again today. You should also be aware that a second British Prime Minister, Harold Wilson, spoke at DePauw in 1981. So today we welcome to our campus the third British Prime Minister to visit with us in the last half of the 20th century, a practice we do hope to continue. After the DePauw Choir performs Harold Hanson's Song of Democracy, it shall be my pleasure to introduce today's guest, the Right Honorable Margaret H. Thatcher.
Continent alone. Whose resume and titles on thy keel ship is steadied by thy spars. With thee, time voyages in trust. Thee and defeated nations sink or swim with thee.
As noted in today's program, Margaret Thatcher served as Prime Minister of Great Britain from May 1979 until November 1990. The Great Britain Mrs. Thatcher has worked for is a Britain poised for greatness in the 21st century, a Britain without socialism, where enterprise can flourish, a Britain that will be proud once again. She has tackled her goals with an evangelical mission. Charles Ogden has written and described her as a modern medievalist who sought solutions to the problems of 1979 Britain in much the same way as the knights of old sought the Holy Grail. To Margaret Thatcher, political battles are fundamental battles between the forces of light and darkness, good and evil, and the enemies are those people who oppose hard work and enterprise, those who would threaten freedom. Mrs. Thatcher possesses many of the same traits of character that her fellow conservatives in America do cherish. She values entrepreneurship and seeks to stimulate an enterprise culture. She is a firm believer in democracy and dares to take the risk necessary to preserve democracy as a way of life. As you will discover, Mrs. Thatcher is direct. Mrs. Thatcher is witty. And she is a determined individual who was described by Jeffrey Wheatcroft in the Atlantic magazine this way. Margaret Thatcher was initially cut off by the traditions of her party. It was a chaps party. Chaps who knew each other in school, chaps who knew each other at the university, chaps who knew each other in the army, chaps who met to talk and drink in the House of Commons smoking room, or chaps who met in the clubs of St. James Street. This was a camaraderie from which a woman, by definition, was excluded. And so, he writes, Margaret Thatcher had to plow her own furrow, make her own friends, and attack the citadel of power from outside. And this she did. Mrs. Thatcher has been called a woman who changed Britain, making it work at home and count abroad. She truly has rewritten political rules and has certainly enlarged Great Britain's world role. Mrs. Thatcher, we welcome you to DePauw University.
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, you have given me, Mr. President, the most marvelous write-up. It's quite something to have left office to get that sort of write-up, but I very much appreciate it. I understand now the special link between myself and DePauw. It would be that Harold Macmillan was the Prime Minister when I first entered Parliament in 1959, and also was the Prime Minister who gave me my first ministerial job at the Ministry of Pensions and National Insurance. So there is an unexpected link. I regret to report I have no direct link with Mr. Wilson, except that of being in stern and vigorous opposition. It was for me a great honor to be asked to come and address people of this very famous university, which has a reputation for excellence, because excellence is the only standard worth striving for. And its achievement applauds not only those who reach it, but it pulls up standards everywhere else. I'm very grateful for the lovely music that we've heard and congratulate both the orchestra and the choir. It reminds me very much of what Yehudi Menuhin, who lives in the same square in London as I do, said to me about the importance of excellence. He said, I was taught as a student, always keep your eye on a distant star. I think that, plus the devotion and resolution to reach that star, is really the secret of excellence. Anything less is not a sufficiently ambitious objective, and though one may never reach it, one willfully goes on, always trying to live up to the very best of one's own abilities and the teaching from which one has profited. It's always good to be in a university. I gathered so much from my own time at Oxford as a chemistry student. It unlocked a new world for me, as it will for you. The purposes of universities are several. First, to pursue knowledge for its own sake. That, of course, is how they originally came into existence, how the objective was a person to be cultivated in the literature, often in the sciences, in history, and in the very, very many arts. Knowledge for its own sake. Today it has a much wider role, because we need, in the modern science-based industrial world, so many people specifically trained for particular jobs, for vocational training, that too must be a very much important part of the life of the university. And the third thing, which I think only universities can do, is to study all of the laws of science, to follow the things we do not know, to unlock the secrets of the universe, whether they be in outer space, whether they be in the innermost working of matter itself, or whether they be in the working of the miracle of the human body. This perhaps is some of the most exciting work, and it's very interesting that the research goes faster and faster, and something else goes faster too. It took years and years for science to be turned to the use and benefit of the wider population of our countries and of our world. Indeed, it's only really in the last 2 or 3 centuries that that has happened. But now we find that the new knowledge is being turned very fast indeed, particularly in medical science, to the benefit of all our peoples, and we are having a very much richer life because of it. Now, I understand that my predecessors who've spoken to you have spoken about the Soviet Union, and I understand why then that you asked me to speak about the changes in the world which will have come about because of the changes in that country and changes in other countries. Before I turn directly to that, and conscious of the fact that we're coming up to the end of a very remarkable century, I think it might be as well to put everything into context by just looking to see how much better a century this is as we have come up towards the end of it than it ever was at the beginning, so that we may therefore determine to make advances in the century that is to come from the knowledge and understanding that we now have. I've chosen to take a few points. At the beginning of this century, very brutal tyrannies arose, and we had to defeat them. Brutal tyrannies, the most obvious ones were fascism in Germany, also in Italy, the fascism in Japan, had first to be beaten, both in the First World War and again in the Second World War. We went to beat them by battle, because they were totally at odds with all of the ideals which we in the Western world had built up and which we held. And we found that it very strange that in the 20th century, when we knew what constituted civilization, that there should still be countries in the world which fell under the total domination of a tyrant and could not free themselves. So we had the rise and defeat of fascism in this century. The defeat because of the great ideals of the Anglo-American alliance. And now we have more democracy. So in one way we've gone from the greater tyranny to the greater democracy, not yet complete the world over, but towards the greater ideals for human rights and human beings. Secondly, the idea that you can take land and hold it by conquest, it has become, in this century, an idea of the past. Of course, people have attempted it. They attempted it, for example, in the Falklands. Saddam Hussein attempted it. But by this time, we knew that you never appease a tyrant. He'll only go on doing worse things. And again, we went and saw that that conquest could not stand. And it is now accepted in international circles, apart from a few tyrants who have been born throughout time and will be born again, that it is not acceptable as a basis for conducting international relations. And so now, towards the end of the century and in the latter half of the century, we formed firm alliances and strong defense to be a warning to any such person who wanted to achieve other lands and peoples by conquest. The third thing is that we have gone from great empires, first of which might have been conquered or created by diplomats drawing lines on maps. We've gone from great empires, most of them have dissolved into initial and separate countries, so that people have been able to recover and honor their own national identity. If you look, that is really very much the lesson of the last century and this. As the number of empires that broke up, you could count their legion. The Turkish Empire, the Ottoman Empire, broke up after World War I. The German Empire, broken up after World War I. The great Austro-Hungarian, the Habsburg Empire, broken up in the same way after World War I. The Dutch Empire, they used to own Indonesia, broken up after World War II. The Belgian Empire, the Portuguese Empire with Mozambique and Angola, also fallen apart. The Spanish Empire too, long since. Even that very nice, benevolent organization, the British Empire, has, in the post-war period, and we were only 5 independent countries when we fought the Second World War, Britain, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and South Africa, has gradually brought each and every former colonial territory to independence, varying from India of 700 million people to small islands in the Caribbean or in the Pacific, such that now it has become a commonwealth, and 50 nations that used to belong to the British Empire now are full members of the United Nations, each with a vote. So we have gone, nations put together artificially have tended to revert to their own national identities. The 2 examples of this century that are most recent are, of course, the Soviet Union, which was an empire put together and held together by force, and I'll speak more about that later. And we are now seeing Yugoslavia, which is put together artificially after World War I from peoples who had no natural sense of identity. On the contrary, some of them always looked to the West, others always looked to Russia and to the East. They had no natural sense of identity. After Tito died, they held together for a little bit. Now they're falling apart. So we mustn't be surprised if, in fact, we get the same thing happening in the Soviet Union. It is rather a more natural consequence of the previous force that once that has been removed, people wish to return to something to which they have a natural link. The fourth point, at the beginning of the century, there was no international structure to uphold what we would call civilized values. plans. Of course it was done by many summit nations, by various congresses, as foreign ministers met together, and later heads of government met together. But we hadn't got an international structure at all. There was great talk of it after the First World War in the United States. That's when the expression "a new world order" first came into existence. And of course they formed the League of Nations. It didn't work. The United States never joined. It didn't work at all. But now, coming to the end of this century, we do have a great international structure which is only just beginning to work. It is, of course, politically the United Nations, of more and more members as each nation comes up to membership, the United Nations, with 5 permanent members: the United States, the Soviet Union, China, France, and Britain. They hadn't until recently worked together because the fundamental philosophies under which, if you could call Marxism a philosophy, the fundamental ways in which the countries worked were so different that it was extremely difficult for us to work together. We are now doing so since the crumbling of communism. So you've got the United Nations setting the moral tones and moral standards. But let me point out, the United Nations, when it came to the Gulf War, did not in fact fire a single shot. In order for those moral resolutions to be put into effect, for the latest tyrant to be beaten, it was independent nation states of high moral ideals, like the United States and Britain, which led the way to deal with the latest tyranny. So you still have to work through the national unit, although you get the moral blessing from the United Nations. Indeed, I think that people sometimes criticize nationalism quite wrongly. Of course, if a nation gets under a tyrant like Hitler, it is frightening. But it's not the national loyalty that is frightening, it is the tyranny that is frightening. If nations who have as their objectives democracy, liberty, under a rule of law, it is these nations, the nationalism or patriotism of these nations, which actually have to be mobilized to defeat the tyranny. And so now we have the United Nations. For countries that get into financial difficulty, we have the International Monetary Fund, which works well, has done a good deal for the countries of Africa, and will do a great deal for the former Soviet Union. We have the World Bank, through which we can operate to help third world countries who need capital. And we also have for trade, and trade is the lifeblood of the world. It is what gives us the industry, the commerce, and the trade. And the freer the trade gets, the greater the world prosperity will be. So we have an organization for that. The General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, I have to report it's not working very well at the moment, because there's rather a lot of protectionism being exercised, which is preventing some of the advances which should be imminent. But we started the century with no international structure. We finished the century with a great international structure. Then I think the sixth thing I would say, and I have only 7, we have gone, I could go on for more, but I'm just trying to paint and set the scene as to how much better we've done towards the end of the century. We've gone from expediency in politics to a moral basis. This is very, very important. So often people used to think we had just a miscellaneous collection of policies, and you did whatever was expedient. I can remember calling together a conference of very, very distinguished international lawyers when I saw things like the Soviet Union going into Afghanistan and various other endeavors to take over nations, and saying to the lawyers, now look, we really have to have a clear basis upon which we can totally condemn this. We condemn it on a moral basis. And I remember them saying to me, look, the fact is that big countries will look after the interests in their own sphere. And I said that really wasn't good enough. We all, if we belong to United Nations, had to have a moral basis for action. I didn't actually have to look very far for it. If ever you look and read the writings of Winston Churchill, who's not only a marvelous marvelous war leader, but also a very great writer and a very great person who understood human nature and was constantly trying to raise it up to the best that's within it. And I came across this just before we entered the Second World War, you and us. And he said this: there must be a moral basis for foreign policy. People in this country, after all we have been through, do not mean to be drawn into another terrible war in the name of old world alliances or diplomatic combinations. Note his definition. He said, if deep causes of division are to be removed from our midst, and this is the important thing, it can only be because of lofty and unselfish ideals which command the allegiance of all peoples here at home and stir the pulses of the English-speaking race in every quarter of the globe. Do you realize now how far we have gone from an age when conquest could take over territory and peoples to an age when we talk about a moral basis for foreign policy, to an age when the United Nations talks about human rights, and when we become much bolder in condemning countries who do not follow human rights? The last thing, the seventh thing, is this: much of the industry which took place at the beginning of the century, when we perhaps didn't know as much about pollution as we do now, fouled a good deal of the land, the rivers, and the seas. We now know that we must, in fact, look after what is the lifeblood of the planet, which is the whole balance of nature, whether it be on land, whether it be on rivers, whether it be on seas. We also know there's an extra reason for doing that, because the increased population in the world itself means enormous extra pollution. If you take the increases in population in the world, you'll find as you get increased people, you get an increased number of cattle in the same proportion, so you have agricultural problems. During my lifetime, the population of the world has doubled, and now it's 5.5 billion. It is expected to go up to 10 billion by the year 2050. Think of the extra agriculture, think of the extra industry. We have to pass on the planet as best we possibly can with its balance of nature intact. We are aware of that. So may I say to you, as we're looking into the future, we can really take a considerable amount of satisfaction from the improvements that those who came before us have made in this century. And we should be very, very grateful for what a much greater proportion of us have the most excellent education we have now. And it is our bounden duty to take on those improvements into the future. Now, as I reminded you, many problems remain, but let us have a look at this particular problem of the Soviet Union. Tyranny is an old thing understood the world over. It comes because of the lust for power of those who wish to have sole power, and they are totally ruthless in how they get it. They have secret police, they watch people, people have to conform, they have no freedom, they have no life of their own, they live in misery. This century saw a new tyranny. Now, it was communism, but it was just as big a tyranny as Nazism. Its methods were the same, even worse. Total control of the lives of people. Communism went even worse. It dispossessed everyone of their land so that everything belonged to the state. It dispossessed everyone of their job. So that if you had a job when it took over as a professor, or rather distinguished job, you had to go to the Communist Party to get it, and you'd only get it if you were a member of the Communist Party. It was the most total form of control of people's lives that we have ever known. It was enforced by military might. It was enforced by the KGB. It operated as Nazism did, by setting children against their families. Indeed, the person who got the Communist Youth Prize was the one who was in fact eulogized for having informed upon his parents. There are enormous things in common between Nazism and communism, but communism had this totality of effect. No private property, no right to your own job at all. no possibility of choice. And it came about in 1917 as a coup against Kerensky, who had brought democracy to Russia for a few months for the first time. Its objective was to dominate the world and to have world communism. I studied it as a young student. We watched it grow up in the Soviet Union as more and more countries became allied to Russia. They took over Georgia, the Ukraine had come, and all of the other countries, until there are 15 countries, all under the communist yoke. After World War II, and don't forget, we fought that to free Poland and Czechoslovakia. They, because of the peace treaty then, came, alas, not into freedom, but having fought Nazism, they then had to endure a terrible spell under communism. And in a way, the strength of the new technologies enabled communism to have a firmer grip on people. But later it was to work the other way, as they couldn't stop the messages of freedom from getting into their country. In the post-war period after the Second World War, we naturally, being idealists, thinking we'd finished one tyrant, we would be all right to disarm, started to do so, until we noticed precisely the full efforts and tyranny of Stalin, and how he was trying to cause trouble with other countries, and cause trouble over the four powers in Berlin. And we had to start to rearm, so that we could say to this new tyranny, your objective is worldwide domination. You want to reach it either by military might, or by military threat, or by subversion, or by financing revolutionary movements everywhere. Let us make it clear, you will never, never win by military might, because we will have more powerful forces. Whatever you have, we will have them more powerful. And what is more, and it was a very important decision, President Reagan, realizing that the free world always had the greatest advances in research and technology because of the freedom of discussion, because you didn't have to ask to do these things, the freedom of discussion, decided to go ahead on SDI. That was a whole new development in weapons technology, and it was that which first, I think, made the Soviet Union realize they could not win by military might. That was a very important step. It was about that time, President Reagan and I were both working together, that we were bringing human rights very much more to the fore and tackling the tyrannies as to why they would not allow their people freedom of worship, freedom of speech, freedom of movement, freedom to look at all of the great books and all of the great periodicals, why they jammed our broadcasts and so on, why these things were happening, what was it they were afraid of. And we changed the whole tactic from just defending liberty and containing communism to defending liberty and fighting the battle of ideas against communism. Not going in by conquest, by military might, but fighting the battle of ideas. How much better is the life and world based on what is second nature to us? One, liberty, not coming from governments, but God-given rights with God-given talents and abilities which no one should take away and which a government should be able to allow people to pursue. Liberty, the moral quality. It does not exist in the abstract, but you have to have a rule of law in a civilized society to enforce it. Otherwise, the liberty would only be the strong against the weak, and so you get the importance of the rule of law and independent judges. It has to be backed up by private property. It has to be backed up by what they now call a market economy, what I prefer to call in an enterprise society, because wealth is created not by the speeches of governments. If you listened to the speeches of politicians, you would think that wealth could be created with every speech and a new right be created with every speech. That is not so. It is created by the ambitions of men and women wanting to improve their lot and setting up businesses the world over to do so, and the private property. And we began to tackle all of the battle of ideas on this basis. And about that time, I looked in the Soviet Union for people from the next generation who I thought would have a different idea, who would look around the world and see that their own creed was not producing either any dignity for man nor any prosperity. We discovered Mr. Gorbachev, and when he came over to Britain, it was the first time he'd ever visited a non-communist country. And he saw a totally different way of life. And I think he saw then the totally oppressive life in his own country. He was a great visionary, a great idealist, and a man of great courage. Without any of those things, he couldn't have done the marvelous things he did in the Soviet Union. Let me just say that when he became Secretary General and later President, he gave the people those fundamental rights which really belonged to them always. Freedom of speech he restored, freedom of worship, freedom of debate, freedom to elect your own Supreme Soviet, letting the television in to see how the battles, how the debates went. And if you've been used to visiting the Soviet Union, when you then went, the whole atmosphere had changed. People would actually talk to you freely. They didn't have to look around to see who was watching them. It was the most wonderful thing that he did. And when a coup came against him, it was the knowledge that people had their new freedom, and that if that coup succeeded, they'd have to go back into no liberty of speech or freedom of worship, no ability to elect their own members, that kept them determined to defeat that coup, which under President Yeltsin they did. President Yeltsin, when I first saw him, had not become president of Russia. It was his great ambition to be so, and he succeeded. He had the same objectives as Mr. Gorbachev, but felt that the economic freedom, the economic liberties, should have come more quickly after the political liberties. As a matter of fact, it was a very difficult thing to do, because in the Soviet Union, in Russia, they'd only had a few years, about 30 years, between the Tsar enfranchising the land and the coming of communism, in which to develop any enterprise at all. Before that, they had lived totally under tyranny, almost for all time, and went back under it again. And it's not easy to say to people, look, now you've become free. You must take responsibility with freedom, and you must turn around and start to run your own factories, decide what you plant, how you get it, and also try to have responsibility for looking after your own enterprises and families. They didn't know how to do so. So it is a very much bigger task to bring the economic liberty and the enterprise to them, which is what they want, than it was to give them political freedom. You know the joke that always went around the Soviet Union. The only way they could hit out at their government was not to work very hard. Why should they work very hard? It was the only way they could demonstrate to their government they didn't like them. They used to say, well, we pretend to work and they pretend to pay us. And that was the way that things went on. And so the goods were not well produced, and that was the only way. So when you're going to turn around and say to them, look, you must work harder, produce goods, because it's other people and yourselves that will buy them, and the more successful you are, the more pay you will get and the better you will be. It's much easier to sell this idea to the younger people, and I must tell you, when I address the people in the University of Moscow and in the University now of St. Petersburg, they're Thatcherite to a man and woman, because that's very good news, isn't it? So they are longing to learn. The thing that I must point out is that we defeated communism without having to sacrifice great life. It crumbled. After the victory against Germany and Japan, we spent a lot of money, a lot of effort on teaching them democracy, on helping them to build up their industries. Because Winston said, after victory, magnanimity. So in Europe, it was a Marshall Plan. In the Far East, you helped Japan to build up a democracy and build up a totally different concept of industry and commerce. After after communism crumbled, it hadn't cost us a life, it hadn't cost us any loss of resources. And I feel very strongly indeed that we should help them the more because we didn't have to make sacrifices ourselves. And I'm very pleased indeed with the new package, which is only a start, which will help them to set up the structures of liberty. They haven't even got a sound bank. They didn't know how to manage their money supply. There are no independent courts. Why should there be? It was the diktat of the Communist Party. There are no independent people, professional administrators. Why should there be? It was always members of the Communist Party, and there were 18 million bureaucrats, each with their little regulation, and some of those regulations are still there. After the coup, the same thing happened to that Soviet empire as it happened to previous ones. They wanted to revert to their own national identity. It will be better that way. It leaves us problems with the nuclear weapons, and that is a problem of the coming century, because far many more peoples will have access to them, and far more of the technology is known. But the great asset, the great advance is that if we make the system work in the Soviet Union, or in the countries of the Soviet Union, a system based on our ideals, liberty under a rule of law, creation of wealth by an enterprise society, private property, the importance of the family, all of these things, and a full democracy under which you've got the limitation of government powers. If we do that, we've made the greatest development of democracy for a very long time. So it's in our interest to help them. In the countries of Eastern Europe, they mercifully are free now and going ahead faster with building a free enterprise society because they have not been communist so long. They still too are needing help. Now, can I then just go on to how Europe itself is trying to give help and its shortcomings? People ask me about 1992 and 1993 in Europe. That is not a single currency or a single monetary policy. That is a single market, which is what we've been working for a very long time, so that all the goods have the same safety requirements and all the same standards. We have one great problem in Europe. It is protectionist in agriculture. That is stopping the negotiations with you and Japan in the GATT. And it is also meaning that the countries of Eastern Europe cannot pull up their own standards by exporting their agriculture and their textiles and some of their steel products to the Europe next door, because I'm afraid we have high tariff borders in the single market, and it is those which many of us wish to get down. Because it's no good talking either to the countries of Eastern Europe or to third world countries and say, look, we will give you aid, but we will deny you the dignity of earning your own living through trade. And that is a problem which must be dealt with very much during the coming years. May I have a brief word, Mr. President, about Japan? I know some of you are very worried about the great success of Japan in certain manufacturing industries. Japan is very successful in cars, in electronics and cameras, and in the automated machine tools. You needn't worry and shouldn't criticize a country whose industries produce products which are well designed and of such good value that you choose to buy them. What you should do is make certain that your products are better designed, better produced, better value, so that people choose to buy them. There is one advantage that the Japanese do have when they come to set up in our countries. It's a very considerable advantage. I know because I did some of the negotiations of the Japanese big companies coming to Britain. They insist when they come to build a car factory, take an example, that they will come provided they can have one union only. Now, most of yours and ours have, in our case, we had 6 to 12, and most of our car companies are some of yours as well, 6 to 12 unions, each with restrictive practices. And the Japanese said, we will come, we will set up on a greenfield site, we will take on people, and we have one union only. And I said, and I expect it happened here, if that is a condition of your coming, you say, it's a factory with one union or no factory, no jobs. Now, they've come with the one union, but what happened, and it's happened in my country as well as yours, when the established car factories and car producers, the Fords and the General Motors, and in our case the British Leyland, said, right, or the Ford said, right, we're setting up a new factory in Britain, we want one union. The union said no, because that'll affect your other factories in Britain. And so we didn't get that Ford factory. Now, the lesson is for the unions to realize that if they want more jobs, they too must take part in seeing that the whole business for which they work can get increased efficiency and therefore keep their costs down. But that, I think, is one thing which is one of the things I had to do was to revise the whole of trade union law, because it had become grossly unfair and inequitable. Because in fact, it was unfair as between employer and employee. It was unfair as between the member of a trade union and the trade union official. And the trade union members in a closed shop, which we stopped, had to come out on strike if they were called out on strike, even though many of them would have preferred to go to work. So we changed our laws and we have very, very few strikes. But that is one of the reasons why some of the Japanese new factories have an advantage over the indigenous ones. Otherwise, may I say to you, as the most enterprising country in the world, you need not worry. You're not brilliant just in 4 sets of industries. You are brilliant in oil, in gas, in pharmaceuticals, in chemicals, in chemical fertilizers, in all of the great industries, whether it's textiles, whether it's furniture, whether it's all the metal industries. You're brilliant right across the whole, whether it's in food, gathering food, or food production, frozen food, right across the whole swathe of industry. That is the great United States, and you have nothing to fear from a country which is very good in just 3 or 4 industries. Now, have you got the message? You're good and you should be confident. And you built up enterprise, and you did it by valuing the individuals and by giving them liberty, because wealth creation too is a moral factor in that it uses the talents and abilities, God-given talents and abilities of people to build things up themselves. The final thing I wish to say, because I've gone on far too long, and women don't normally speak longer than men, at least that's what I found in the House of Commons, but in spite of everything, in spite of the big organizations, and there are many, many of them, in spite of an age of technology, the most important thing in life is not merely the technology, it is the individual. Wars are won not by machines, important as they are, important as great technology is. Wars are won by individual men and women with the honor, with the determination, under very good leadership. It is just the same in industry, it is just the same in negotiations. It is not the whole system that wins anything. It's not liberty as a system. It is individuals within that system which take advantage of all of their talents, who are satisfied with nothing less than excellence, and who, in fact, get the very best out of themselves, teach the very best, and give their families the very best. It was perhaps put at its best by Tennyson, and it was not a poem that I knew, but I came across it again the other day. And he's speaking of the miracle of creation. And he said this, him, speaking of the great creator, who wrought not matter, nor the finite infinite, but this main miracle, that thou art thou, and power on thine own act, and on the world. No speaker could have said it more economically. That is what moves the world, that thou art thou, power on thine own act, and therefore on the world. I wish you well in all your great endeavors, in the rest of this century and the next.
Mrs. Thatcher has very graciously agreed to answer a few questions from either our students or our faculty. So for the next few moments, if you do have a question, and some of you obviously already do, you've found the microphones in either of these aisles. If you have a question, you'd like to come to the microphone, state your name and your question, Mrs. Thatcher will be glad to respond.
Hi, Mrs. Thatcher. My name's Kenny McQueen, and my question to you is this. There's been some question about whether or not John Major is going to remain the leader of the Conservative Party, and I was kind of wondering, are there some individuals that you would look at as being key people who would come into leadership should John Major have to be brushed aside, basically?
I support John Major wholly and hope he will still be Prime Minister on Friday. Our election is on Thursday. Next question.
Mrs. Thatcher, my name is John McCormick. In 1982, you made a speech where you described the environment as a humdrum issue. In 1988, you said it was one of the great challenges of the 20th century, and you said something similar earlier today. I was always fascinated, how and why did you change? Did you change, in fact? And particularly, what effect did the European Community legislation have on changing the policies of your administration?
One changed because we gradually became to know far more about it. One changed because the scientific basis revealed a very great deal more. And we know a good deal more about it, both about the ozone layer, well, about the three levels. One is the planet itself, at the levels which, of course, you have to act as a world. It's no earthly good our keeping down carbon dioxide if someone else burns a massive amount of indigenous coal and makes no efforts to keep it down. We also found the science basis, or the science of the acid rain. Well, we knew the science of it, but it was becoming quite clear that there were cause and effect, and we had to deal with that on a local basis. The pollution of rivers we were always dealing with and cleaning up, not as an environmental matter, but just as an ordinary matter of common sense, and the refuse collection. Other things became called the environment afterwards, and as the scientific base became clearer, it was very evident that we cannot just leave it, because although no scientist that I know will necessarily say that the warming of the earth is due to what man is doing on the earth, it may be, and if it were, then by the time we knew that scientific evidence, it would be too late to take the necessary action that we can take now. What effect does European regulations have on Britain? the ones that are particularly difficult are those which can be passed by majority. Now, we had to have majority regulations in order to get a single market, because otherwise we found it very difficult to get the services into Europe at all. And many countries in Europe are very, very protectionist, particularly on services, particularly on transport. We had free cabotage in Britain. Any ship could come from mainland Europe, drop a load in one of our ports, pick up a load there and dock it in another of our ports. But we could not do the same in some of the European ports. So we weren't going to get the free movement of services as well as goods unless we had some majority voting. I think the trouble is the majority voting has been taken too far, and on things which we thought we were safe because we had delineated them as unanimous voting. It does have an effect, because once a regulation has been passed, it becomes our law, and therefore can be enforced in our courts. So we watch very carefully what they are, because it can, if you get too many European regulations, it can undermine democracy, because your commission is not responsible to anyone. It's great powers and unelected, not accountable to anyone. And you ask people to obey the law, not as a favor, but as a necessity. And the normal reason is either because of ancient habit and custom and convention developed from the common law, or because that law has been created by your own parliament, which is responsible and accountable to your own people and can be turned out of office every 5 years. So we're obviously watching the number of regulations that come out with majority with very, very great anxiety. And it was the reason why we refused to go ahead with the social charter, which is actually a socialist charter and goes way beyond all rhyme or reason, and comes in because people love regulation, which we hate. Right, thank you. Next question, over here. Yes, it's working.
It's on? Okay, it is now. My name is Diane Paget, and this question is also concerning the elections. It's speculated on Thursday that neither party will receive a majority in the House of Commons. If that is the case, a coalition government will need to be formed. What type of coalition should we expect? And do you foresee any immediate policy changes as an outcome of a coalition government?
As Mark Twain said, never prophesy, especially about the future. The strength of my country in recent years has been that we've had no coalitions. We've had clear leadership with clear majorities and clear decisions. It's done a great deal for Britain and for the wider world, and I hope that will continue. Over this side.
My name is Lucy Schlauk. I recently read a book by Ronald Dworkin called A Bill of Rights for Britain. In it, he argues that in the 10 years of your government, Great Britain gave up many basic human rights in the name of national security. Dworkin further argues that in order to avoid further erosion of basic human rights in Britain, it is necessary for Parliament to pass a Bill of Rights based on the European Convention for Human Rights. Today, you talked a lot about human rights and avoiding a tyranny. Isn't your avoiding passing a Bill of Human Rights kind of tyranny in itself?
We had a Bill of Rights in 1689. You inherited it. It ensured the supremacy of Parliament. It is that which is possibly being undermined by some of the things which Europe is doing. In my time, we put some of the security services on a statutory basis because that was required. And I would quarrel very deeply with the book to which you refer or with the summary which you give of it. We enlarged the liberties of the people very greatly. None more so than those who write and those who are on television and radio. I do say to many of them, I say to many of those newspapers, you wouldn't exist unless I got rid of restrictive practices. And I said to many of television, you wouldn't exist unless we had freed things up for more television stations and more radio. So you're free to say what you like, and I'm free to answer. We freed up the freedom of speech, and I'm always happy to answer questions about it.
Hi, my name is George Bashaw, and I'd like to extend our appreciation for you to coming to DePauw. I'm sure it was beneficial for you as well. It was a very stimulating speech. My question is on the concern of the extreme nationalist right party in France by Le Pen, who has gained a lot of support, and also the neo-Nazi movement in Germany. And it seemed to be a surge, maybe a surge, not necessarily just in Europe, of racism and particularly in France, anti-Semitism and anti-alienism. Also in the United States with David Duke being able to get such a support in Louisiana, where a large majority of the population is Afro-American. And I would like to hear your insight on that.
The insight is very straightforward. Each and every person is born with some talents and abilities and has a bounden right to be able to develop those within a rule of law. The law is colorblind. That is the God-given talents and abilities. That is what we mean by the sanctity of human life and the talents and abilities. It isn't always easy to bring them the world over, because you've got to have a rule of law to do it. Perhaps we don't talk enough about this. In Europe, I think people have a fear that if we surrender too much of our national identity, we are surrendering our own power to act in accordance with our own traditions, and ours are very great, from Magna Carta, habeas corpus, Bill of Rights, trial by jury, the right to develop and dismiss, the rights to elect and dismiss your governments, just like yours. Their feeling is that unless the main parties pay attention to the national sovereignty, because it's your sovereign right as a nation to do certain things, and subsume many of those sovereign rights into Europe, you will find that it is the extremist parties that come to the fore, because they then take up that cause, and it becomes an artificial cause. You've got in politics, when I said you have to have a moral basis, the moral basis is that human life is the sanctity of human life, the talents which each person has, the contribution which each can make, bringing out those talents and abilities, and within a rule of law. And if you stick to that, you will be all right. And then you fight the other antis on that basis. That would be my reply to each and every one of those criticisms.
Perhaps one more question.
Shall we have one from each side? Yes, one more from each side. So I'm afraid the rest of the queues can disappear. I'm so sorry. Here and here, yes.
My name is Bob Reel, and this country owes you a great deal. I think we ought to give you a hand. You have stood shoulder to shoulder with us in our time of needs. But the question I have is that we still have communism in China. 1 billion people. That's still a big threat. And how would you address that?
Yes, can I just thank you for what you said first. I think you'll find that civilized values have really come from the English-speaking peoples. The English language is soaked in values. It is founded upon the Old Testament and the New, which are the only two religions that fundamentally honor the individual and make him accountable for his actions. And it's that, I think, which has gradually moved the world. Now, China. Deng Xiaoping, with whom I had to negotiate over Hong Kong, is determined to have economic reform and is pushing it as fast as he can. I think that for them that is a wise way to go if that is the way in which they can achieve most advance, although most of us believe that the right to democracy will come, and the demand will come especially from the young people, and we saw their great bravery in Tiananmen Square. But the Chinese, as you know in this country, and as you know wherever they are in the world, are born traders. It's just in their blood. They just take to trade. That's why they built Hong Kong out of nothing. That's why they built Taiwan out of nothing. Why Taiwan is the second largest creditor nation the world over. That's why they built up Singapore. They're very active in Malaysia. They come to California. They are born traders. There's a Chinese takeaway in practically every town in the world in a free country. And therefore, it is much easier, strangely enough, to build up the economic reform, and they are having private property with it. So you can purchase and have the private property. They haven't yet got a private property law in Russia. So I think you'll find that China will come up. It'll become much, much more prosperous because of the talents and abilities of her people, because Deng Xiaoping is determined to give them full reign. But he and his generation are totally against political liberty, which is a bitter disappointment. But I believe that once you've got the one, you'll find the other will follow. But we ought to be already thinking about the whole economy of the Pacific when you've got a prosperous China. Of course, you've got Japan, and you'll gradually get a more prosperous Indonesia. It'll be a very, very different world. But I'm quite optimistic about it. Thank you very much. Last question.
Mrs. Thatcher, my name is Nathan Hall, and my question pertains to the upcoming election. With Great Britain in its current economic status, it's in sort of a recession, and the Conservative Party has been unable to do anything to counteract that. What do the people of Great Britain have to gain by re-electing the Conservative government?
The kind of policies that restored our fortunes and restored our reputation in the world. Long may they continue, and may they be reaffirmed on Thursday.
Mrs. Thatcher, on behalf of the entire university community, our students, faculty, alumni, trustees, and friends, I want to thank you for sharing your morning with us. Finally, before we do adjourn, let me request that all of our guests and friends in the audience, please do remain seated in your places as Mrs. Thatcher exits the stage. It was good to have you with us. Have a good day.